quite often a useful way to remember significant periods of time and history and even significant religious epochs are through objects. If you go into any museum, it's basically a way of walking through and remembering and knowing what's happened in the past by connecting with and looking at objects. We saw this particularly with the coronation of our king recently. He had the crown and the orb and the scepter, and all of those spoke powerfully about the reign of the king, but how they were under the rule of God, and a tradition that stretched back hundreds and hundreds of years, but all of it remembered and encapsulated by these objects. And as I was studying Jonah chapter 2 this week, I couldn't help but see that some of the things that appear in this chapter are a really good way in to see how this story actually connects to the rest of the Bible, and I hope to be able to show you how that is. It, in a way, retells the whole story of the Bible, of what God is doing with humanity in the world. How does it do that? Well, as we thought about last week, this is a tale that sets Jonah sometime probably before Israel gets captured and sent into exile as the northern kingdom, because Assyria is their great empire to the north. They had famous kings like Sennacherib and Tiglath-Pileser, and they were one of the most barbarous and cruel empires. And Jonah gets this incredible commission and call to go and preach, because it looks like God actually wants to save them. And Jonah is having none of it, and he legs it as far as he possibly can in the other direction, but he doesn't get very far because God sends a great storm, and the sailors he's with, who have no knowledge of God, end up being converted to God and throwing him overboard to try and save themselves. So that's where we got to last week. So Jonah's just been chucked overboard. So what's going to happen now? Well, what I want to do is I want to think about three kind of objects and in this chapter, and I want to see what they tell us about how God actually intervenes and rescues in our lives. The first one is the pillars of the earth and the heavens, and I'll explain more about that. The second one is the great fish, or reasonable translation would be the sea monster that appears in this. And then thirdly, I want to think about, did you notice there's seaweed in this passage? Seaweed is my third point, so I hope I've at least intrigued you as to what on earth that could mean. The pillars of the heavens and the earth. In verse 3, so Jonah's responding to this whole thing with a prayer that sounds like a psalm, and it is actually a psalm. It's stitching together at least 7 or 8 psalms from the book of Psalms. Okay, it's an amazing work of literature. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. The deep surrounded me, in verse 5. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth barred me in forever. Okay, so in the ancient world, they saw the world, this is before Galileo, this is before really there was a developed cosmology, but they still saw the world in a way that made sense to them, and I still think does still make sense theologically. They saw the heavens and the earth. And the higher you ascend in the heavens, that is where God dwells and lives and reigns. And the lower you descend in the earth, you are further from him. And the lower down reaches of the earth and of the seas is the absolute abyss. We still talk about that. None of us really want to spend much time down in the very depth of the heart of the deepest parts of the ocean. That's why we pay people insane amounts of money to go and do jobs that require that. Okay, it's scary down there. We don't know what's going on down there. It's very hard to fathom, to tame, to explore. And it was the same at this time. And so Jonah is relating that he's sinking down into disorder, into the unknown. He is going down into waters which cannot be fathomed or tamed by human beings. And it's actually connected to and related to Genesis 1. How? Do you remember how God opens the Bible? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. In the beginning, there was chaotic, dark waters that had not been given form and had not been given order and structure, and so as yet it was a realm of chaos. And God, by his Spirit, comes and brings life and order to it. And you remember later on in Genesis 1, it says that the dry land he separated from the seas. If you like, he founded where the dry land should be. And Jonah and his audience would have been aware of this. And so he's quoting that. What he's saying is, I went down into the place where no one should go. I kept on sinking, and what he's saying is I was descending and there was no hope for me. He went to the very pillars of the earth, the part that is only the domain of chaos, and chaos in the Old Testament often is the same as death. He's basically saying, I'm going down into the underworld, and the earth barred me in. I'm going to go down so deep that there's going to be no rescue and no hope for me. The pillars of the earth are down there where God alone knows what it's like, and he thinks, well, if I'm there, I'm really in trouble. And he thinks, I'm far from God. But look at what he says in verse 6. To the roots of the mountain I sank down, but you, Lord, brought me up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. So look at the picture. He is down at the foundations of the earth with no hope of being rescued or recovered, and going into what he sees as the abyss of death and chaos. And he thinks, I'll call out and I'll cry out to God to see whether that'll make a difference. But it doesn't seem likely because the gap just seems to be so wide. And then he says, miraculously, God hears and acts from his holy temple. So in this part of the psalm he's praying out, you have the contrast between the depths and the pillars of the earth and the majestic structure of where God lives in the heavens. And despite the great gulf and gap between them, God hears Jonah in that temple. God is not unconcerned. As much as he dwells in splendor and heavenly light, he is not indifferent to the cry of Jonah for help. And so let me make this concrete for us, because I think we're meant to feel, why does Jonah take 4 or 5 verses to describe his descent into the depths? He could have just said, I sank down to the bottom of the sea. But he does it because, as we often find with poetry, we're meant to go on a journey with the writer and what they're explaining. And you're meant to feel that, and you're meant to perhaps even see yourself in that, in a time in your life when you knew things were going wrong and you were sinking down. Or you knew you were feeling far from God, and every day just seemed to bring you feeling further with a sense of hopelessness. And who among us, as a human being in this world, hasn't faced that? Maybe you feel like Jonah, that it's not actual water surrounding you, but it is chaos in life. It is a sense of things that you cannot control swirling around, and you wonder how much stamina you have to keep your head above the water, so to speak. And so what's the significance of that for us? Whatever our chaos and our storms are, God is not indifferent to them. However implausible it might seem to us that God would hear about that and be interested in our lives and our troubles and our struggles and our chaos, he is not indifferent. He cares, he can hear, and I think the promise of the story of Jonah is he will hear from his holy temple. There are many conceptions of God that have a God who dwells in unapproachable light, and that is where it stops. But the splendor and the marvel of Yahweh, of Jonah's God, is that he does hear from that holy temple. So I promise you this morning that whatever you have been going through or you are going through, and however much chaos you feel it is, God is not indifferent. He will and he does hear you from his holy temple, and he will act. So that's the pillars, from the pillars of the earth, from the depths of the abyss, wherever we find ourselves, we can have access and communication with God in the temple of the heavens. And then secondly, the great fish. Now the Lord, in verse 17 of the last chapter, provided a huge fish or sea monster to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of that fish 3 days and 3 nights. And then eventually the fish vomits Jonah out onto dry land. The fish is so interesting because, as one of the children answered, he was there for 3 days and 3 nights. If you see 3 in the Bible, you should be thinking, there's something more going on here. If you see 40 in the Bible, it's the same thing. 3 days and 3 nights and 40 days and 40 nights always usually point to either a time of testing and God's salvation coming to fruition at the end of it. It's never an accident. And so he's in there for 3 days and 3 nights. And I think his audience would have been aware. There was an ancient Sumerian myth at the time that said that one of the gods tried to communicate and go down to the underworld. And in order to get there, it was a journey of 3 days and 3 nights to actually get to the underworld. And it's not a happy ending. They didn't manage to come back. They were kept there forever. But I think there's hints of that in this story. I think as you're going down, maybe the original audience are reading going, how can Jonah possibly come back after a journey of 3 days and 3 nights down towards the underworld? And then if you're reading this, you're going, a huge fish swallowed Jonah. That is surely game over. That's surely the end of the story of Jonah going to preach to people and trying to get them to repent, because who is coming back from that? But most stories about a great fish or sea creature or monster in the ancient world have them as an untamable beast. So not only are the seas untamable, everything in them is, including these monsters that roam. And this story just has a different spin on it, because in the hands of God, what should be just another agent of chaos coming to sweep away somebody's life is actually used as a vessel of salvation, because nothing in the creation is beyond the hands of God, and nothing is beyond being able to be used in the hands of God. Now, this is, when I was studying it this week, this was the coolest thing I think I've ever seen in the Old Testament. So it requires a wee bit of mental engagement, but I hope you'll stay with me, and I hope you'll find this as interesting as I did. Okay. In chapter 1, where it says the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, the noun there is, those of you who know languages, the noun is masculine. Okay? Then in chapter 2, when it says Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days, the noun for the fish or sea monster there changes to feminine, inexplicably. And commentators have argued and wrestled over, but why? That doesn't make any sense. Why would it do that? I think this is the best explanation, because this is amazing. The picture then becomes of Jonah inside the belly of the fish and waiting to be pushed out. It starts off being a story of Jonah being consumed by another angry and hostile creature. And then it becomes Jonah being housed and being kept and being saved from the waters until he can go on to the next phase of his life and carry out his mission. It's almost like it's meant to convey the idea of him being encased or in a womb. And then he's going to be born or reborn out in order to fulfill his mission. I actually think this is how Jesus understood that story, because you know in Matthew 12, Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees, and they say, give us a sign, and he says, no sign will be given, well, except for the sign of Jonah, who was in the belly of the fish. Now, Jesus actually calls it a monster in the Greek word in the New Testament. He was in the belly of the monster for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he was brought, if you like, back from the dead, essentially. The sign of Jonah, if you will, is that you may try to run from God, you may try to do things your own way, But if God has set his love and his purposes on you, he will find a way that even you, through your own attempts at self-destruction, and even if it's an attempt at rebellion, God will find a way, even through the greatest storm, to bring you through it and then to renew you and give you new life. Everybody who comes to know God has to experience that rebirth. Some people don't even know when it happened. They just know that they live like a Christian. Some people can tell you the exact moment and hour. That's when I was born again. That's when I was reborn. I think this is a picture of rebirth with Jonah, because he goes into something that looks like death. Paul says in the New Testament that he has died to self and died to the world, and he is alive to Christ. There's something that fundamentally changes. And this isn't just, it is a story. It's to invite you, if you've never been through that, it's that in this world of chaos and death, that God invites you to be reborn into his life and to find new purpose for your life in him. But it's more than that. It's also, you see, Jonah's not what you might call an altar call person, someone who's been invited to come and trust in God for the first time through this fish. He's someone who rediscovered his faith through this ordeal and through this situation. Do you see? And I think that's where a lot of us are, so I hope this is where it's relevant for you, is that what I get from the story of Jonah is that even if your faith has become stale or stagnant, or even if you feel like you've walked away from your faith, and you might have, if you did for a long time, for years, nothing is beyond the reach of God, and no one is beyond the reach of God. And God is able to bring you into a similar situation where you go through a way where you are encased in his protection and his love and guidance, and you come to a moment and realize that he's coming to make you new again. God can and will and does renew our faith as many times as it's needed. The rebirth, yes, is something that changes our status. As Paul says, we pass from death to life. But it's also this amazing hope that we have as people who are belong to God and are Christians and are in the kingdom of God. Is as many times as we need to be renewed, God will provide that. And a fresh injection of life through his Spirit, and repurposing sometimes even of our lives. The rebirth is what it's all about, and that's actually what happens. Christ is the ultimate symbol of that, because he goes into what looks like certain and assured death. He dies a criminal's death on the cross at the hands of the Roman Empire, aided by his own people in Israel. And he goes into that death, and it looks like the end of God's purposes and kingdom and plans and everything Christ has been preaching about. And on the third day he rises again. He's raised again by God to give hope and life to all his followers, to begin his kingdom, but to show us that God brings new life and salvation out of what looked like certain death. That might be a word for you today. And lastly, the seaweed. Where's the seaweed? You hurled me into the depths of the seas. The engulfing waters threatened me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I think seaweed's not the best translation. I think a more fair one would be reeds. You find reeds in shallow water reeds. And I said this story connects to the whole, really, of the story of the Bible, because it connects to Jesus, talks about it in the New Testament. But also, the Red Sea that we know from the Exodus story is also known as the Reed Sea. Perhaps more properly known as the Reed Sea. And almost certainly geographically, it had shallow water reeds, either surrounding it or going through it or at the sides of it. And what I think is going on here is that reed that somehow gets tangled in Jonah as he's emerging from this ordeal that he's been through, and this rebirth and repurpose that he finds a reed. And as somebody who's a prophet of Israel, he's remembering the people to which he belongs, the God who has called and made them a people, and the salvation that God provides. It's a memento, if you will, of what God is like and what he's been doing in Jonah's life. My daughter, Autumn, loves to collect things, and for the September weekend, we went to St. Andrews, and we went to the beach, and she spent most of the time with a bucket just picking up different forms of discarded marine life and seashells and bits and pieces, and she just loves to collect and keep things, and they end up all over her room. And so she's picking up these shells, and I'm thinking they are going to stink out the car on the way back. And I was trying to negotiate with her, to maybe leave them, and she nearly started crying, and I couldn't handle that. So I ended up in the toilets near the beach in St. Andrews with soap and water from the things, trying to wash them all out and trying to make sure that we could somehow get these mementos back and she could hang on to them, because they were important to her. They remind her of times that are precious to her, and I think that's very sweet. But we all have that thing with objects. Do you have this thing sometimes now where you go into and you're doing the washing and you check the pockets and you find a mask and it reminds you of something from a couple of years ago, and you think, my goodness, we lived through that and we go through to the other side, and just objects that remind you. I think that's what the reed is doing in this story. Connects back and he thinks, oh, that's the God of the Exodus. That's a God that led people from what looked like certain death, and he parted the waters. And again, the waters looked like they were going to destroy a people's hopes, and they made it through. It's the story of Israel. Right now, when Jonah's preaching, they're nowhere to be found in terms of God. They've got exile hanging over them, and exile will happen to them, and they will be exiled to the abyss. They're not going to have any connection with God anymore, and they're going to need some new sort of tangible connection to some hope in order to get them through, and that does come in the New Testament. You see, none of us can go down so deep or so far where God is not going to hear us and not going to remember us. And sometimes what looks certain to threaten us and overwhelm us and overtake us and destroy our lives can and will be used by God to renew our connection and hope in him, and particularly to place our trust in Jesus, because he went through the darkness of death and Calvary in order that he might give us hope and life on the other side. And perhaps for us, a bit like the reed, maybe for us we can reflect on times and places and spaces where we know God was there, and we knew he was hearing us, and we knew he was intervening in our lives. And it gives us a bit of hope. And it's a good practice for us in our journey, because this life is hard and it does throw unexpected things at us. But if we can have small anchor points, mementos, whatever it looks like for you, to remember the identity of your God, to remember that he has set his love on you, and even your biggest rebellion or going in the other direction, or the chaos of the circumstances and the abyss around you, is unable to separate you from the love of God in Jesus Christ. May God bless this word to us this morning. Amen.